Good evening. Welcome to the QCIS channel. Where on this channel, you get a daily dose of science, technology, engineering, and math. My name is Leon Jones, and tonight I want to talk about site analysis. And site analysis is basically part of land development or subdivision design. Now, it's very important because there's a lot that goes into site development, such as zoning. You have regulations that deal with the environment. You also have permitting. You have to deal with the public. You have to deal with politicians. Because what you're looking for when you're analyzing a site, you're basically looking for an area where there's going to be a project constructed. Now, some people don't care about projects in their backyard. It's known as NIMBY, not in my backyard. However, that project that is being built, suppose it's a hotel or an apartment complex or a strip mall. Because you have to remember, when we deal with any type of land, first you need to know what type of project is going to be constructed. Is it going to be industrial? Is it going to be residential? Is it going to be commercial? Bottom line is, if you're an area that doesn't have a large population and you bring in a strip mall or a couple of strip malls, a few hotels, certainly it's going to bring more people into the area. What you have is more taxpayers. Now, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And what I want to talk about is what we know as site analysis. Now, a lot of these slides come from a course that I took at Old Dominion University. At that time, it was called CET 425, Land Development. It's now CET 325. Now, the information that I'm going to present to you comes from that course. And during this presentation, you're going to hear some legal terms like easement, riparian rights, property law, because this is part of land development. So what I have on the agenda, I'm going to talk about zoning, comprehensive planning, real property law, subdivision ordinances, site plan regulations, and of course, building codes. Now, real property laws, when we take in effect constitutional law, common law, and statutory law. Now, one must understand when we deal with constitutional law, it takes precedence, defines relation between of executive, legislature, and judiciary. Now, where have you heard those terms? If you've guessed the branches of government, you are correct. That's to keep balance. So one branch of government doesn't have power over the other branches of government. Then you get common law, AKA. Common law is what that does, it sets trends, and there are case laws. And something that's statutory, that's a law, that's known as written law. Now, property law basically shows proof of limits of ownership by a boundary that's been surveyed. And this is why you have to be a licensed surveyor to go out and do boundary line or property line surveys. And of course, property law derives authority from Constitution and laws passed. When we talk about property classification, then we talk about ownership rights. What's affixed to the land? What's growing on the land? What's going to be erected on the land? And of course, we deal with the transfer of title. And a transfer of the title comes from the consent of the property owner. And when you have an agreement, it could be a sale, it could be a will, it could be a gift. And in surveying, particularly if you're taking surveying law, you're going to deal with land description. And with land description, you're going to have a deed. A deed deals with metes and bounds. It's a form of contract, and it's a written instrument. And right here, you see what we have, a legal land description. You have townships, metes and bounds. Now, some states, when we deal with surveying, has metes and bounds, like the state of Maryland. Metes and bounds deal with your directions. So you're going to have azimuths and bearings, where when we get into PLSS, which started in Ohio, you're going to have townships. Now, your township is divided up into 36 square miles, and you have 36 squares right in those 36 square miles. Now, we have a big section right here. This whole section right here is 640 acres. So each quarter of a township is 40 acres. Each half is 80. And then you can go ahead and break it down further and further and further. You're going to see a lot of this if you are interested in surveying. A lot of laws on the surveying exam. And then we deal with the metes and bounds. Again, it's a system to describe property by direction and distance. Again, we deal with the bearing. North, 30 degrees, 45 minutes, 60 seconds. And the distance from point A to point B starts from known point of beginning and it returns to that point. That's what we mean by metes and bounds. Adverse possession deals with your doctrine. There's certain common law requirements that must be met. And those requirements are continuous. It could be hostile, open and notorious, actual and exclusive. Easements. You always hear that word in surveying. When we deal with easements, you have a permission to use or enter an access portion of property. Generally, utilities or multiple use driveways. And these easements can also be permanent or temporary. Now, an example of an easement. A owns 2 lots. Here's A's lots, sells front lot. This is the front lot. Must reserve easement to access house from buyer. This right here in between these 2 lots would be the easement. You have your public street. This is A's 2 lots. He sells the front lots. So again, to enter the house, he has to have access. And this is what the easement is. We're going to enter it right between the lots. Intimate domain. Now, you may have heard of that. Can be ugly. There's a lot of controversy around intimate domain. And basically, it's when the government has the power to take private property to convert to public use. A lot of your DOTs will do that. They want to expand the road. Now, what they basically do, they will send an appraiser out to appraise your property and offer the right price. Now, basically, the price is going to be at market value. And then they're going to get you to sell your house. And of course, you're going to have to move because now they obtain that property for their use. I know there's been some issues here in Indiana with NDOT. They've taken some properties on US 31, and what they want to do, they want to make that US highway into a limited access highway. So individuals could travel free flowing from South Bend, or basically from Benton Harbor, Michigan, all the way down to Indianapolis. But eminent domain, again, it can be very ugly. And to understand what eminent domain is, it's the government's ability to use their power to take private property so they can convert it to public use. Water law. Under water law, there's ownership, control, and use of resource. And basically, water law is influenced by environmental law and their water rights. Encompass, public waters, other surface water. There's treaty rights, water project law, groundwater, and public regulation of waters. Riparian rights. It's a doctrine. It means water belongs to adjacent landowner. Owners permitted to use the water. You see a lot of that right here. Here's your riparian zone. Here's the stream bed. Well, generally the water belongs to the adjacent owner. Case in point, the Potomac River. Now, it's funny because the Potomac River divides Maryland and Virginia. But who owns the Potomac River? Maryland owns the Potomac River. Yes, Maryland owns the Potomac River. Subdivisions. What a subdivision is you divide land into lots and you sell or develop. So you can have a map, whole plat, and then that land is basically divided into different lots. And with the subdivisions, most people believe that it's just residential. No, with subdivisions, it could be commercial and industrial as well. So you have residential, commercial, or industry when we deal with subdivisions. Now, the four cornerstones of regulation. You have comprehensive plans, subdivision ordinances, we have capital improvement planning, and of course, zoning. So when we deal with comprehensive planning, it's basically a statement of goals for new development, and it dictates policy. And it's under, I'm not going to click on the link, but you have it right here. Comprehensive, you can go, and this is an example, 7.2, page 125. That's where you're going to find your policies. And of course, all this information comes from Virginia, comes from my old school, Old Dominion University. And then you have your objectives, your goals. So when we deal with land development, we want to talk about utilities, services, and facilities, parks or recreation, open space, resources, employment, economics, industrial population, and of course, transportation. So we deal with zoning. Now, there are different categories of zoning. There's agricultural, there's mixed use. Now, what is mixed use? That's a new one that has come about in the last I'm going to say 5 to 10 years or a little longer. Well, when something is mixed use, you can utilize the facility for living or residential and commercial. Case in point, there's some facilities out in Fishers, Indiana, no Portage, Indiana. I know Lebanon. They're starting to build all of these places. Indianapolis has a number of them. You have all of your restaurants at the bottom. In fact, on Market Street in Indianapolis, right across the street from the Cummings building. Cummings is the building that makes engines. Well, there's a residential building. And that residential building sits on top of a Whole Foods market, a Whole Foods market. And also, I believe it's on Ohio or Michigan Street in Indianapolis. You have another residential apartment building. Sits right on top of a Kroger's grocery store. So when we deal with zoning, we're dealing with the device of land use planning. And we talk about the legislative means, and that's going to be the requirements for the intensity, use, and the layout. Residential zoning by density, transient, permanent, 2 or more units per building, 1 unit per building, 5 or less persons. Now, breakdown. When you see one of these maps, you have an R. The R, you're either going to have an R, you're going to have a C, or you're going to have an I. Your R means residential. Your C is going to be commercial. And your I is industrial. Now, R40, it could be 40 homes, 15 homes, 10 homes, 8 homes. Now, the requirements, others may dictate setbacks, height, impervious areas, signage, open space, and parking. And the history of zoning, well, the earliest zoning laws were segregationist, New York, 1916 zoning law, the laundries, San Francisco, and of course, growth management. Now, what is zoning exactly? What is zoning exactly? Well, the purposes, zoning limits overcrowding, overbuilding relative to public services and facilities, stabilization of neighborhoods, segregating incompatible land uses. Then you have your tools, your ordinance, and your maps. And then you have your nuisance zoning, fiscal zoning, and your design zoning. Your nuisance zoning, it's example that's used to separate heavy industry and residential zones to protect against external noise, smell, and position. It's used to separate heavy industry and residential zones to protect against noise, smell, and pollution. Of course, separation is the most simplistic way of dealing with external effects of industry problems. Doesn't reduce these effects, just moves them. Spillover. An industrial zone may be far from residents in the municipality, but close to others. Euclid versus Ambler in 1926. It was a Supreme Court case on validity of local police power for zoning. It was a small commuter suburb, that's Euclid. They wanted to stall encroachment of Cleveland's industry. Ambler owned real estate, mostly zoned industrial commercial, but some zone residential. The court upheld the city's right to zone based on two criteria: legitimate public interest and due process. Now, the zoning tools, you have variances. Now, the variances basically give the landowner an exception to some zoning rules. And what happens is the variances, we call them use variances, it permits otherwise unacceptable use without change of zone. Then we have variance from standards. It allows use that doesn't meet standards that others must meet. Then you have your ostensibly for hardship exemption if some feature of land makes it impossible to make use of an under existing zoning. Talk about an odd lot shape or big border. And that's called ostensibly for hardship. Then we have our subdivision ordinances intended to protect the health, safety, and welfare for its citizens. These ordinances also facilitate community growth in a controlled manner. Components. Well, you look at this map right here. Remember what I told you about a subdivision? Here's a cul-de-sac. These are all your lots. Well, the components, when we deal with subdivisions, we have to deal with utilities such as water and sewer, drainage, parking, and of course, street design. Right here. This is when I lived in Virginia. This is Mount Pleasant Road back in 1990. I believe this is in Chesapeake. This is a subdivision. You can tell this is Mount Pleasant Road in 2010, going back to 1990. See this? This was all farmland back in 1990. 20 years later, this is now part of the subdivision with the 1990s subdivision as well. Now you have a small subdivision. And let's go back to 1990 again. This is more of a trapezoid. This is the 1990s version right here. There's nothing here. And in 2010, land was bought, parcels. It's adjacent. It's known as Chapel Hill Estates. This is adjacent to the subdivision in 1990 off of Mount Pleasant Road. Site plan. Well, in your site plan, checklist followed by various departments. And when you deal with cities, you got to have codes. It must be approved, of course. You have utilities, public works, and fire. These are the various departments for your site plans. Then you go through a review process, and that requires central submission. Go through various departments, and they're going to approve or disapprove. And whichever comes, you're going to get comments or feedback, whether your review is approved or disapproved. Building codes, not part of land development planning, but they are adopted to protect the lives of building occupants and to guarantee safe, habitable, durable structures. Code violations. See right here, no fire stopping. Nice hot shower right here. Should have this tagged out if they're going to be working on it. This is very, very bad, especially if it's in the shower. You get shocked, you become a conductor. Plumbing, very bad plumbing. This is why you have codes to make sure that these violations are basically fixed because it's for safety. This is why you have to know your codes. Codes change. And again, this is one of my old school assignments. But bottom line, here's example 7.2. This is from the textbook. The textbook is by a company I used to work with. It's called Land Development Engineering by Dewberry and Davis. If you're not familiar with Dewberry and Davis, they're located, I believe, off of Braddock or Fairfax Boulevard, one of those roads, but it's in Fairfax, Virginia. Dewberry and Davis, pretty large engineering firm in Virginia. And that's where you're getting all this information from. Right now, they're on their third or fourth edition. And here are your zoning districts right here. This is actually Burlington, Vermont. And when you look at your maps, and this is a part of looking at a map, you have to understand what your legend says. Like, okay, everything in yellow. You see, I already told you what R meant. R meant residential. Well, and I'm just going to say an amber or gold, it's residential, high density. Then this lighter color is residential, medium, RM, residential, medium density. Then right along your waterfront, you have your waterfront, residential, medium density. And then you have your residential, low density. This is all this right here. And then you have your waterfront, low density. And that's right here. Part of reading a map, understanding plans, is knowing what that legend says. And this is right around the campus of ODU, which is off of Hampton Boulevard. The Elizabeth River is right here. Now, remember I told you about a mixed use unit. This is what a mixed use unit looks like. Okay, here's an office building. This is where people work. Right here, these are apartment buildings. Now below, this is where you have your, looks like a Panera Bread, your Buffalo Wild Wings. And there are a lot of these out here, a lot of mixed use buildings going up in your cities. And then your transportation. I believe this is Norfolk. When I lived down in Norfolk, this wasn't even there. This is your rail system. That's what that is. This is a light rail. And right here, it's your landscape. And I'm going to get into more sustainability because that also goes with land development. And this is a residential neighborhood right here. Ranch house. And then we get into feasibility. Different types of feasibilities. But when you have a feasibility, you establish progress or project goals. Feasibility. You establish project goals, you have maps, secondary information, and then you have what we call an evaluation. So basically, you're dealing with a part of land development, and what I just presented to you was site analysis. And what I also put in the PowerPoint, you had a little bit of law, you had a little bit of the process, shows you a mixed use type of unit, and I showed you some code violations, and I also showed you what the R codes meant. So you had an overview of site analysis from the PowerPoint that I gave you. It's very important. So if you're going to get into design, particularly as a civil engineer, if you're working in the private sector, you're going to do a lot of land development. So you'll be designing an area that's going to feature residential homes. You may have some commercial properties. You may have some industrial properties as well. But most of your firms like a Dewberry and Davis and your CEC and DLC, there are a number of them out there. CMT, KCI. Well, KCI is their firm. They do basically everything, including testing and inspection, which you're going to deal with a lot of land development. So that means you need to know environmental regulations. You need to know about storm drains, streets, surveying. You need to know about codes. You need to know about best management practices. You need to know about adjacent properties. If they're adjacent properties, you need to know how to read a plat. You need to find out, because that's in Virginia. Virginia is one state that deals with meets and bounds. Now, here in Indiana, we deal with the public land surveying system. That is very, very big. And this is an area where surveyors can actually do some design, because when you're a surveyor, you actually work with what we call land development and subdivision design. So basically, I've given you an overview on site analysis, and that concludes this topic on site analysis. If you like what I just presented, please comment, share, and subscribe. And if you're looking for some political and some social content, check out my main channel, the 411 Talk Zone Radio Show channel. Now, here's the deal for these two channels, because I upload videos for both channels. Now, for the 401 Talk Zone Radio Show, once I pre-record my videos on YouTube, I also upload them to X, which is Twitter. Now I'm also on Rumble, and I also use True Social. Now for the QCIS channel, I upload videos to X, which is Twitter, and LinkedIn. So again, please like, share, and subscribe. And thank you for viewing this content of site selection, site analysis, right here on a QCIS channel. On this channel, you get a daily dose of science, technology, engineering, and math. Till next time, my name is Leon Jones. You all have a wonderful and gracious evening.